So I would like to request everyone to take their seats. We will soon start our second panel discussion of today's event. Okay. We will wait for another half a minute. There must be some serious discussions going on there. Maybe we should join them.
It's usually more interesting there.
That's right. I will try to take it as much as it is. I'm going to be as provocative as possible. Please do. I wasn't expecting anything else. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. This is our first EastSec Forum, hopefully not the last. And this is the second, but the last panel of our event titled Navigating Geopolitical Ties in Europe's Eastern Neighbourhood. So the first panel was dedicated to the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which is overshadowing and dominating political discourses regarding Eastern Neighbourhood. But let us now shed some light on other sometimes overlooked aspects of our shared neighbourhood and its security and geopolitical aspects. I would like to first introduce our panelists. We have here Tornike Sharashenidze, full-time professor and head of the MA program of International Affairs at the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. We have Rusif Husseinov, who is co-founder and director of Top Chubashov Center in Baku, Azerbaijan. We also have here Yevgeny Pregerman, founder and director of Minsk Dialogue. And last but not least, Georg Malikian, founder of the Armenian Institute for Resilience and Statecraft. Thank you all for joining us today. It is a great privilege to have such a distinguished panel. So, Europe's eastern neighborhood is one of the most dynamically changing geopolitical areas in the world. It is not a single region. However, the vast landmass from the Baltics through the Black Sea region to the South Caucasus does have a lot in common. Starting with their shared past of Russian and Soviet dominion, all regional states, including Russia, have paid a heavy price for the democratic transformation and or gaining independence in the 1990s. From Belarus to Azerbaijan, 6 republics have been participants of the EU's Eastern Partnership, well, not anymore. And finally, the socio-political development of practically all regional states are heavily dependent on the outcome of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I would like to first start, I will take a geographical order, if you don't mind, and start from the north to the south, and with Mr. Pregerman. Let's start with you and Belarus. It is a country deeply integrated into Eurasian cooperation mechanisms, from the Eurasian Economic Union to the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is a partner country to BRICS and so on. Belarus used to have dynamically developing relations to the EU too between 2011 and 2020. It was a participant of the Eastern Partnership, but it has withdrawn since. Recently, however, some substantial confidence-building measures have been taken by Washington and Minsk, withdrawals of sanctions and regarding some human rights issues. Could you please elaborate a bit what has happened and what are its long-term prospects?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for organizing this wonderful forum, and I really hope it can become annual. Geographically speaking, I'm no longer sure that I'm, the most westward participant on this panel, given how long it took me and now takes Belarusians to get to Central Europe. Instead of 2 hours, it's now almost a day, but hopefully we can correct that. Thank you for the question. Let me correct you right away on Belarus status within the Eastern Partnership. We haven't withdrawn from the initiative. We have suspended our participation in response to the massive sanctions that have been introduced since 2020, but I think we took the decision in 2021 when those sanctions started to look massive. And of course, in a way, this is a good metaphor to describe the Western Belarusian EU relationship. So things have been suspended and frozen, but they haven't been ended altogether. At least on the Belarusian end, there is a clear interest, which is, pretty easy to understand, to return to some kind of dialogue and as massive cooperation as possible. The other problem is that, of course, on the European side, most of the initiatives coming out of Minsk are received with silence at best, sometimes even with some words which are not nice to pronounce in a respected audience like this. You're right that the last several months have seen some kind of dynamic between Belarus and the United States, which definitely is having an impact on Belarus EU, well, let's say dialogue or lack of dialogue, but if we manage to proceed and progress in the dialogue with the Americans, I think it will inevitably have an impact on what we are discussing with the Europeans, even though when you talk to people from Brussels who seem to live in their own world, of course, they say that everything has already been decided because all the council conclusions are there, and according to the council conclusion, there can be no discussions or dialogue between Minsk and European capitals. But I think, of course, at some point they will have to change the rhetoric, again, provided that we can achieve some progress in our dialogue with the Americans. I think the very simple reason why the Americans, and by the way, the initial impulse came even before Donald Trump entered White House again. The initial impulse came last year during the final months of the Biden administration. So the reason they started thinking about some kind of rapprochement with Belarus is simply because, you know, when you look at the stated goals that the Americans as well as the Europeans had towards Belarus, saying that they were introducing sanctions because they wanted Belarus to change certain things in terms of, you know, the domestic situation, but also foreign and national security policy. All those things, of course, you know, have not been changed in some respects according to the Americans and the Europeans themselves. I mean, the EU bureaucrats, for example, themselves. Those things have gotten even worse. And that's why, you know, it doesn't take you rocket science to understand that if you continue doubling down in sanctions and those measures do not work, then at some point, you know, it's only reasonable to start considering a change of course. And this is exactly what happened in Washington. So while, as I said, they were trying to start reaching out already at the end of the Biden administration, of course, it was only reasonable for Minsk to consider reviving some kind of dialogue after Donald Trump has entered the White House again, and this is what happened. And because of, you know, some successful back-channel discussions that have been taking place and some unilateral steps that Minsk offered as a sign of goodwill, I think we managed to create a little bit of initial trust in that dialogue. And over months, it has led to some results which both sides are happy about. But those have been sort of preparatory steps for a more substantive discussion on bilateral relationship and perhaps even, you know, broader on the future relationship between Belarus and the West. It is, as of now, difficult to be sure about the exact results that we might get out of the dialogue. But on the one hand, I would, you know, warn everyone not to be over optimistic, or let's say, I would warn against over expectations there, because I think there are some fundamentals and some fundamental interests on both ends, including in terms of Belarusian national interests, that will not allow any kind of you know, revolutionary progress there. And I don't even think we need a revolutionary progress. We just need to normalize the relationship and to start talking like normal sovereign countries. On the other hand, I think there are very good prospects for that. And as you know, recently the United States have lifted some of the sanctions against the national airline of Belarus, and they have even, you know, taken several steps there because the initial decision to lift sanctions was only very partial. Now I think it's exactly what Minsk expected. I think there will be more steps that Minsk will take in the weeks to come. The problem is, of course, that without the Europeans and primarily our neighbors, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and the Poles, certain things are difficult to, you know, to achieve progress on. And even with the good dialogue with Americans, we need to somehow make sure that the neighbors also reciprocate. As you know, 2 days ago, Poland took some positive steps in terms of opening more border crossing points, and potentially it will help me next year to come to your forum quicker than what has been the case this year. But we are currently in a border crisis with the Lithuanians, and they've now closed the border yesterday with our Lithuanian friend, we almost resolved all the problems at 2 a.m. at night, but let's see where it leads us tomorrow. There are some good indications there. But jokes aside, I think we need a fundamental solution there, which is not just Belarus-EU, which is not a Belarus-Lithuanian bilateral issue. We need a solution that will help all of us in Belarus, but also in the European Union, including Hungary, even though there is some distance between the two countries, to ensure that we start being really serious about the military risks in the region. I think this is the crux of the matter which we need to deal with right now. With all the dynamic which was discussed in the first panel, I think we're really facing a dangerous moment where, as was discussed yesterday during the closed part of our conference, we're in a period which reminds 1914 or times around that period. I don't like historical analogies very much, but I think we are really sleepwalking into a major crisis unless we understand the dynamic and unless we take the proper measures in terms of reducing military risks. And Belarus can be key there. The Belarusian variable is important. I'll stop right here because I've taken a lot of time, but if you're interested, we can continue this discussion.
No, I think we should stay for one more minute with you. And on this note of steps taken for confidence building, what steps do you see at this moment, now that you mentioned that Poland has taken some minor steps, what could be done more on a bilateral level with your neighbors and on a multilateral level?
You mean between Belarus and the European?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that the US has taken some steps regarding sanctions. What could the EU have done over the past couple of months, and what could it do now?
Well, I think it is easy. The Belarusian-American dialogue shows one simple thing, and that is through dialogue and respected conversation, you can achieve much more than through pressure and unilateral sanctions. So, of course, the Brussels people, as I mentioned before, keep telling us that there are council conclusions and numerous council conclusions which basically say that no dialogue can take place with Belarus. But again, if you can tell black from white, at some point, reason should also demand that the definition of insanity which Einstein offered, doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result is the definition of insanity. So I would claim, with all due respect to Brussels and the institutions, that what is happening there is exactly the definition of insanity. So I think they just need to look at the example which has been set by Belarus and Washington, which is about dialogue and the results which have been achieved, and do more or less the same thing. So if they join the conversation in this dialogue, Belarus is willingly offering certain initiatives, both in terms of bilateral relationships, in terms of the situation on the border, for example, which has been quite problematic for a long time in terms of migration. And of course, Belarus is accused of sort of facilitating migration. But if we look at the facts, how it all started, and again, I'm not a big fan of who's to blame game, but actually, it all started because the EU and primarily Brussels and the neighboring countries just stopped any conversations about border management and border security. So if they resume those conversations, I think a lot can be achieved. And then, once again, I don't think we should be over expecting things in that regard, but at least we can stabilize things in terms of basic security for both sides, and we can resume more meaningful economic cooperation, which surely, will be in everyone's interest. There are difficult things to deal with. For example, a lot of people across the EU are fearing that if we resume more active cooperation with Belarus, then somehow the Belarusians will help, the Russians, and we want to sanction the Russians, and we want to ensure that the regime there collapses. Of course, this is a slightly this is the thinking which is slightly detached from the actual reality in Russia. But leaving this aside, I understand the argument, but it's also a little bit cynical because if you look at the EU cooperating with quite a few countries that neighbor on Russia, I can give you a few examples of how exactly that results in, some goods that are, for example, being exported to those countries then ending up in Russia. So I don't think, in a serious discussion, this can be a problem for reviving cooperation.
Thank you. Let us now gravitate toward another neighboring region that has been severely destabilized during the the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Black Sea region. Let us suppose that the fighting in Ukraine stops tomorrow and the Sea of Azov de facto remains an inland sea of Russia. Mr. Sharashenidze, how do you see, what prospects do you see for a maritime and coastal security architecture on the Black Sea, along the Black Sea? Will communication and transport channels be stabilized or even developed? Who will be the key players of this process? As a Georgian analyst from the Black Sea region.
Thank you. As for Georgia, hardly anything is going to change for Georgia because you know that a huge part of Georgia and Black Sea coast already has been taken by Russia. I mean, Abkhazia, of course. And I don't think that, no matter what happens between Moscow and Tbilisi, I don't think that Russians are going to, you know, give Abkhazia back to Georgia. Definitely not. And of course, that's one of the factors that remains as an unresolvable problem between our two countries, Georgia and Russia. Many people now in the West believe that Georgia has become a Russian colony. You know, during her latest political campaign, Maya Sandu referred to Georgia as a Russian colony. So that's absurd, of course. Georgia's relations with the European Union definitely has deteriorated, but that doesn't mean that Georgia has become more dependent on Russia. There is no rapprochement between Georgia and Russia. The latest round of Geneva discussions, which has been initiated after the war of 2008, ended up in another disaster. The Russian delegation simply walked out when our delegation raised the issue of the return of our refugees, both to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Georgia has, let's say, as a small country, we have to accept what comes. That's it. With only one condition. We have to preserve ourselves. We are small states. Small states are always obsessed with one thing, self-preservation. It's the most important thing. For the small states, it's always very important, how to say, to be on the right side of history. I recently finished, just a few days ago, the memoirs by Miklos Horthy. And I loved especially one of his passages where he writes that from the American viewpoint, Hungary was on the wrong side of history because Hungary fought alongside Germans. But at the same time, Hungary was on the right side of history because Hungary invaded the Soviet Union. Interesting. So what happened? In both cases, in World War I and World War II, Hungary lost. And so it was on the wrong side of history. We all know that history is written by the victors, by the winners. So being on the right side of history is nothing else but being on the side of the winners. That's it, you know. When the war in Ukraine started, our Western partners wanted Georgia to join the right side of history. Yeah, to be on the side of the Western coalition. But we simply wanted to once again preserve our statehood. We are not on the Russian side during this war. We simply tried our best to stay out of trouble for the simple reason. The first reason, since 2008 war, a Russian military base has been stationed some 40 kilometers from our capital city. No other country, including Ukraine, by the way, and even Moldova, no other country has such a privilege. Second, Russian economy is still significantly dependent, Georgian economy is still significantly dependent on Russia. We depend very much on our exports to Russia, like wines and mineral waters. We depend very much on Russian tourists. Georgia has received DCFTA with the European Union about like 10 years ago, but our exports to the European Union hardly have increased since then. And another point, the European Union has not invested in Georgian economy at all, let's say. Major investments to Georgia come not from the European Union. They come from like China, United Arab Emirates. So the question is, where did the European money go? To the NGOs mostly.
Exactly, but I wanted to stick first to the Black Sea, to the port of Anaklia and the naval base that is going to be established in Abkhazia.
Port of Anaklia, yes.
But we can stay at the questions that you have raised. But so let us now.
I was going to back to because China's factor here is intriguing. I mean, China's involvement in Georgian economy.
Prime Minister Kobakiza just went to Beijing 2 weeks ago.
And the good thing is that the very day when the European Union released its report on enlargement, which heavily criticized Georgia, Georgian governmental delegation was in Beijing, demonstrated, let's say, to demonstrate that they are not dependent on the West that much anymore. Port of Anakle on the Black Sea coast, very close to Abkhazia, actually. I think that was one of the reasons why the Americans were quite skeptical about Anakle, and they did not invest in Anakle deep sea port because of, once again, very close proximity to the Russian military bases which are stationed in Abkhazia. Now there are only two choices. Either it's the Western money or it's Chinese money. The Americans, of course, are not happy with this perspective that Chinese are going to build Anakle a deep sea port. Definitely not, and it's understandable. At the same time, our current government is trying to rebuild its ties with the Trump administration, and there is a fair chance, I would say, that they will succeed at that, because both our authorities and the Trump administration, they both deplore the EU bureaucracy. They both criticize heavily so-called deep state, Soros Foundation, USAID, and so on and so on. I mean, they are very similar in their rhetoric against the European Union. But there is some chance that Georgia will restore its relations with the American government, but at the same time, I don't see any chance that Georgia's ties with the European Union will be restored in a foreseeable future. And for a small country, it's unfortunate, yes.
The Georgian government insists that it remains its commitment to the European perspective, but at the same time there is a growing voice inside Georgia for a third way, a neutral way. Is it feasible, is it possible for such a small state in the direct neighborhood of Russia and Turkey to remain neutral in these dire international regional circumstances?
That's almost a mission impossible, let's say, especially that when the war is going on, you know, it's normally it's either with us or against us. As like my good friend Balazs Arabik mentioned, you know, the European Union adopted Ukrainian viewpoint for its security agenda. So it's Georgia against European Union or with European Union. Georgia once again simply wanted to stay out of trouble because of the reasons I already mentioned. There is no third way for Georgia. There is no second way for Georgia. The only way for Georgia is simply to somehow to navigate among great powers. And of course, the South Caucasus remains still, let's say, the arena of global power competition. And definitely, it affects everyone, not only Georgia, but definitely Armenia, Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is much stronger position because it has Turkey behind it, you know, a strong regional power. Georgia has only one way to go, navigate somehow. Of course, things would be seen to be better if we were like part of NATO, European Union. We are not. We don't have NATO security umbrella. We don't have any, not only security, but even like economic security, not only hard security, but economic security guarantees, not whatsoever.
On that note, let us now discuss a little bit Armenia's pivot to the European Union and the West. Mr. Melikian, what are the realities of Armenia's European perspective that has been initiated by the Armenian parliament recently, and what are the prospects for the revitalization of strategic coordination between Yerevan and Moscow?
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for this very important event, and I am really grateful to you personally and to the Institute for this invitation and for organizing this wonderful discussion. And I congratulate all of us for these 2-day very successful discussions. It has been really very insightful and informative. Let me elaborate a little bit more about Armenia's inspiration for European Union. It's not something new. Armenia started its European, let's say, integration into the wider European family starting from 90s. And Armenia was very active in the Eastern Neighbourhood. And Armenia was about to sign the DCFTA and an association agreement in 2013, but it failed under the pressure of Russia, similar to Ukraine. And Armenia joined the Eurasian Economic Union, which became Armenia's new home, let's say, economically and also politically. Armenia still continues to be part of most of Russia-led projects like CSTO, although there is a narrative that Armenia has frozen its membership to CSTO, but there is a small I would say, manipulation or mistake. It's not the membership that has been frozen, but the participation into the CSTO work, which means that Armenia still remains part of CSTO, which I consider as an anti-Western coalition. My PhD was all about CSTO and NATO, so I was always considering CSTO as one of the main obstacles to Armenia's European integration, which is a part of Russia strategy for post-Soviet countries to have a legal framework to keep them inside those institutions and not to allow others like Western countries, including the US, to have more participation institutionally on those, especially in the security-wise. Armenia is part of Eurasian Development Bank. We don't speak about that too much, even in Armenia. Not many in Armenia know that Armenia is part of that bank, which means that our financial and banking system basically is governed by this Eurasian Development Bank, which is, again, led by Russia. And one of those other things that, in my opinion, impede to Armenia's full integration to the European Union is also that Armenia has aspiration to become part of BRICS and part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And also Armenia is part of Eurasian Economic Free Trade Union, which means that its accession or full participation to European integration activities is much limited than we could even imagine before. I mean, Armenia is still there. We are hosting the Russian military base. We have a Russian military airport. We have FSB border guards on the border with Turkey and Iran, despite, again, some claims that a couple of border guards have been removed from those checking points, but it's, that structurally, Armenia is still part of that Russian border control system. Armenia continues, of course, to have dialogue with the European Union. Recently, the European Union introduced the action plans for Armenia's visa liberalization that Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova went through years ago. But it still remains very questionable if Armenia will do all due steps to fulfill those. Well, I think that Armenia will do. There is nothing I would say critical about that, because since even before 2018, Armenia was all about to sign this, as I said, the CFTA agreement. Plus, there would be the visa liberalization, but it didn't work for some reasons. So now, yes, Armenia's leadership is showing some interest toward the European integration, which basically is somehow limited to giving money to the government. I put it very simple way. There are some projects and programs by the European Union, but I see the European integration as part of broader strategy that is not still there, and European Union is restricting itself just by providing some financial resources to the Armenian government, to NGO sector, which is also, by the way, now even the NGO sector is very polarized, and the European Union is working all with part of NGOs, not all with the other part, which is strange a little bit. There is no like inclusion in these policies. So when it comes to Armenia-Russia relations, there is a methodological mistake that many experts in the West are doing, but it comes from the Armenian government. It's not, probably it's not their mistake. They say that Armenia, for example, is not buying Russian weapons, which means that Armenia is willing to get rid of Russia's security architecture. Maybe we can interpret it that way, but the reality is that Russians didn't want to sell weapons to Armenia. Russians didn't want to help Armenia in its very fragile and vulnerable situation.
Or even deliver the already acquired weapons.
Yes, this was another topic, because some claim that Armenia has changed its policies since 2020 war, but it's not true, because Armenia ordered to Russia after 2020, in 21, 22, didn't acquire because of the war in Ukraine. And we still see that Armenia is very, I would use that word, happy with Russian cooperation. Armenia tripled its trade with Russia over last year, and we have about $13 billion of trade or turnover, which is the double of the Armenian state budget. And Armenia is involved in many initiatives done by Russia, and Armenia's leaders are meeting with Putin regularly, going to Moscow, meeting him on the different platforms. There is no such a thing like saying that Armenia is against Russia. It's a rhetoric that is used mainly by the European Union, American experts. It's a very unfortunate, I will finish now, because I really regret that in the analytical minds of many experts in the West, now things have become black and white, or rosy. Armenia is moving away from Russia. Russia is out of the South Caucasus. Russia is away from the Central Asia. I think that it's wishful thinking, but I think that we should keep our expert approach rather than relying on kind of biases that we see because we want to see that. I personally was one of the adepts and the proponents of the European integration to become part of the European Union, and I'm not living my dream, but I also understand that systemic constraints that Armenia is facing, problem with Azerbaijan, it's extremely complicated situation. It's not, again, black and white, like everything is fine, we are going to sign a peace deal. It's not on that level, unfortunately. We are too far from that sustainable, stability.
Let me challenge you there about Russia-Armenia relations. On August the 8th, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and Ilham Aliyev, Azerbaijan's president, and Donald Trump, president of the US, signed the Washington Declaration that, among many things, proposed the Trump route for international peace and prosperity that would see some private American security mechanisms be present in Armenia. How would Russia react? How would Iran react? How do you see? Is TRIP or a trap?
There are many discussions about that topic in Armenia, and the society and the expert community is split into two parts. One is praising that TRIP corridor, the other part is blaming that corridor or being very skeptical towards that. I will not tell you what parts I am belonging to, but just to tell you that things are more complicated than it can seem. First of all, we don't have the action plan for this TRIP corridor. Second, the Prime Minister of Armenia is always advocating for the opening of all communication, not just that part of the South Caucasus, which is mainly, which will mostly profit, Azerbaijan will profit from them, because for them, what they call it Zangezur corridor, because they don't want to see only the small part of what their project is, but to see how Baku is connected to Nakhichevan, or from Nakhichevan to Ankara, from Ankara to other places, and they want to be part of that hub connecting China with Central Asia and Baku to other parts of the world. Russia, what will happen with Russia? Russians, we have an impression that the Russians are not that unhappy that it can seem, because they think, maybe my Azerbaijani colleague will elaborate more on that, they will use that corridor. And I don't think that there is a problem between Americans and Russians on that part. I don't think that it's a business for Americans, and for Russians it's also a business economic gain. So I don't see why Iranians are worried. It's true, although they made a couple of comments on that. But I think that they will make a deal with Russia and Azerbaijan. So Armenia is becoming sort of, if only the TRIP corridor works, not just opening all communication. What means opening all communication? It means that to be like during the Soviet Union, like Armenia can go through Azerbaijan to Russia, or Azerbaijan can come to Armenia, or Armenia can go directly to Turkey. But this is not happening. At least what Azerbaijani side is saying all the time, and Turkish side as well, that it will be possible when everything, all preconditions are fulfilled. Yesterday, I named all these preconditions I can name for this audience. Azerbaijan has a list of preconditions, although they are not written on the TRIP declaration and on the other document, which was, by the way, not signed, but just initialed. Initialed meaning that it's just, yeah, I mean, it's important, but it's just a beginning, and it will be signed only if. Only if, what? There are preconditions. And just to highlight that Armenia doesn't have preconditions, Azerbaijan does. And it's, again, it's not a strategically correct thing from the Armenian side to basically to obey to Azerbaijani precondition. But the first precondition is to change the constitution, like Russia is trying to do with Ukraine, changing the constitution. The second is to basically go to demilitarization, not to have big army, not to buy weapons. Yesterday we discussed this topic, again, like Russia is willing to do with Ukraine. The third is the return of Azerbaijanis into Armenian villages and towns. And not talking about Armenians who left Azerbaijan many, many years ago, almost similar, I mean, simultaneously, Armenians leaving Azerbaijan or Azerbaijans leaving Armenia. And also talking about the so-called Western Azerbaijan project. So all these things, although they are different in their nature, but these things are a big impediment, big obstacles to moving forward, because basically Azerbaijan says, without fulfilling these requirements, we will not have peace. And we have strong army, we have what they call it Iron Fist. They have this Iron Fist big monument in Nagorno-Karabakh now, just showing to Armenians that be careful, if you don't do what we tell you, we have always this Iron Fist. So basically this kind of power politics is into play on the ground, and Armenian government is trying to just maneuver, trying to understand what to do, and also, which is important, they have to be re-elected. So after elections, if Armenia changes its constitution, we don't know, first of all, it's not sure, we don't know what domestically will happen in Armenia. And the second, it's the Azerbaijani behavior, which is still, I call it a soft colonialism. They are trying to colonize Armenia by different means. I am an expert in hybrid warfare, and it's one of the crucial elements in warfare to make steps that make your neighboring country becoming your client state, basically.
I think it's high time for Mr. Husseinov to react to all of this. I do have some questions for you, but please, first of all, I'm pretty sure you have much to answer the previous one. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I really feel privileged to be in this very panel featuring distinguished speakers. I would kindly ask you to also maybe raise your questions, so then I summarize my answers.
Sure. Actually, my first question was also regarding the Washington Declaration, which Mr. Melikian mentioned that saw the initiation of the proposed peace agreement. What burdens, what obstacles do you see, and does the Baku administration sees before ratification?
Okay. First of all, as Mr. Melikian noted, in Washington, which we hailed as a very historic meeting, which resulted with a joint declaration, we achieved the Washington Declaration and the initialing of the peace text. However, it was not a peace deal per se. Still, in Azerbaijan, this Washington meeting and the documents signed in the American capital injected a lot of optimism in the political establishment, expert community, and the wider society. This peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan is overstudied and over-discussed. I don't want to give you a very comprehensive picture. rather I would try to list several patterns, maybe in a bullet form. First of all, the bilateral nature of the peace process. In the past, we had several facilitators and mediators, but in the past few years, both sides, they switched to this bilateral framework, and which actually produced a lot of progress and accomplishments. And even the Washington meeting, which was facilitated by the American side, would have been impossible without the enormous job conducted by the diplomats from both sides. Second, pace and the elements of surprise. Maybe my Armenian counterparts would not agree with me because maybe they have higher expectations regarding the speed of the process. But for us, the Azerbaijani side, the pace is already enormous. And every day we see some new developments. And sometimes it becomes very, very difficult for us to catch up, to digest and to analyze what is happening between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And the elements of surprise. Again, both sides, especially Azerbaijan, keep surprising observers with the least expected steps at the least expected times. For instance, no one could have expected the recent move by the Azerbaijani side when it lifted the economic sanctions on Armenia and allowed some Armenia-bound cargo to pass through the Azerbaijani territory. Or no one would have expected the bilateral engagement between the expert communities of two countries, and I feel privileged to be part of that framework. And as a member of the Azerbaijani expert delegation, we flew to Yerevan last month in order to engage with our Armenian interlocutors. That was a huge milestone for all of us. Regarding whether we have peace or not, de facto, on the ground, there is already peace. There are no shootouts, there are no border clashes, everything has more or less stabilized, and it also gives us a lot of optimism to start with. Obstacles, yes, Mr. Melikian showed several obstacles and referred to them as Azerbaijani preconditions. For us, they are obstacles or problems. The Constitution of Armenia is the biggest one, certainly, and I think the analogy with Russia would not be so correct in this case. I would actually draw other parallels with UK and Ireland or Greece and North Macedonia, because there are certain things which we, as the Azerbaijani side, feel about the Armenian constitution. We feel that it still contains territorial claims against Azerbaijan, and they should be removed for the full-fledged normalization between the countries. And we have historical analogies for this. As a result of the Good Friday Agreement in 1995, the Republic of Ireland removed certain territorial claims from its constitution against Great Britain. With the pressure of Greece, North Macedonia changed not only its constitution, but its name, flag, and everything. And in that endeavor, many Western countries actually sided with Greece and supported Greek concerns. Connectivity issues. I know that many of our Armenian colleagues, they don't like the very term Zangezur corridor. For us, the Azerbaijani side, it now has received a bigger meaning, a bigger scale. It is a corridor which is starting with Azerbaijan and ending in Turkey. And it spans almost 3 countries. TRIP, which was agreed upon in Washington, is one of the elements of this corridor. Now, this is how we perceive it. How it will be formalized, we don't know, because right now the ball is on the Armenian court, actually on the Armenian-American court, because now it's up to them to agree all the conditions, safety measures, all the points about how trip will actually operate. Last but not least, yes, the Armenian elections next year. They will determine not only the Armenian domestic politics, but also probably the fate of the overall peace process. And the result of this voting will design how this framework, peace activities, will proceed or will be halted or will receive a new shape. We don't know. And this is why this very issue leads us to a paradox. The Azerbaijani side cannot fully trust in this very context the Armenian side, because we don't know who will remain, who will be in power 6 or 7 months later. This is why we cannot go for the full-fledged normalization. We cannot go for fully opening between the two countries. On the other hand, Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan and his team, they have invested a lot in the peace process, and any progress in this very track would definitely boost their popularity, or actually may also backfire with the Armenian society, because there are also some critical voices towards Pashinyan's peace vision with Azerbaijan. I will stop here. We have a lot of interesting questions, especially regarding Armenia-Azerbaijan dynamics to discuss, but I think we can actually go one by one with specific
I think, yeah, unfortunately only half an hour remains, so we will have only one round of questions, but now I can see that Mr. Malikian has to have a short intervention. Please make it short.
Just to, mainly I agree with my Azerbaijani colleague, a couple of comments just to clarify the situation. In Armenian society, it's not against the peace process, but it's against the terms of that process instead of conditions of that process. Nobody is in favor of peace, so please, in favor of war. Please make this distinction. Armenian society is for war, is for peace, but peace should be coupled with security guarantees. Peace doesn't mean security, and also peace doesn't mean at any price. We have our understanding of peace, so it's not about gun pointing method of imposing peace. The second is that we had visits of experts before as well. I mean, many officials have visited Yerevan previously, so there is not such a historic thing. Well, yes, in this context it is, but usually we had this, and the Armenians visiting Baku as well. So this is to say that the Yeah, before 20. Yeah, I mean, this is great thing, and I hope that also Armenian experts will visit Baku. I hope that I can join them. But we have now this the elections ahead, which are very important for Armenia. You are right, and for geopolitically. But it doesn't mean that even if Pashinyan is not elected, it's not Pashinyan who is the dove of peace. Okay, and we want someone on the power to pursue Armenia's interests.
Mr. Malikian, let's not hijack all the Armenia-Azerbaijan issue. Sorry to intervene. Let us now, there has been some discussion about here in this panel already about Armenia's and Azerbaijan's pivot to the BRICS and SCO. And there are media reports that Azerbaijan's membership in SCO was vetoed by India and Armenia's by Pakistan. And there has been also talks that it was also Belarus that raised, that challenged Armenia's pivot to the SCO. Mr. Pekerman, how do you see the SCOs and BRICS role in this Eurasian connectivity and cooperation in the evolving multipolar world order? How is it? How can they engage in other multilateral cooperation networks in the continent?
Well, those two, I mean, the SCO and BRICS are just among the platforms which are naturally rising and developing to a certain extent. within this process of the world going somewhere from former unipolarity, from the unipolar moment, to some sort of multipolarity, which we still do not understand. So in a way, I think that in this transition period we're living through, where we only understand that the past has been gone and we don't understand the exact parameters of the future, you know, these platforms, they are more functional and narrowly focused on certain elements of cooperation than ideological. So I disagree with those who tend to see those platforms or organizations just as, you know, anti-Western alliances. It's true that certain members of those organizations and certain driving countries might see it that way, but in the end, I think for the majority of countries that join them in different capacities as members or observers and so on, and for Belarus, for example, they just serve certain purposes. So as long as we do not have access to proper cooperation with Western organizations, for example, of course, Minsk is doubling down on cooperation within those platforms. And the more we're blocked from benefiting extensively within more universal organizations like, let's say, the United Nations or the OSCE in terms of European security, again, the more we want to be part of those organizations. So in a way, of course, certain Western countries are shooting in their own feet by, you know, non-talking to countries like Belarus, because in that respect they help other platforms to arise. But again, I would warn us against seeing those alternative platforms as anti-something, because it's not in the interest of the majority of countries to become part of some ideological or geopolitical camps. We're rather looking for opportunities as part of, well, hedging logic. I think hedging is becoming quite omnipresent throughout the world and in the strategic thinking of most countries, and those organizations are just serving the purpose. And of course, I need to stress all the time that Belarus is the first European member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is interesting because in the end, just the final bit here, it does change, it does give certain additional characteristics to organizations which in the past emerged for different purposes. As we know, SCO was originally thought as a trust-building mechanism between, well, Russia and China, but also Central Asian countries over border issues there, and of course security and anti-terrorism, anti-extremism agenda was key, and we've seen now how they've developed exactly because of the changes in the international system.
From a regional to an interregional or even a continental, that maybe the South Caucasus could be also part of it. If Europe can, then South Caucasus definitely can. But Georgian case is a bit different because Georgia has made a sort of a civilizational and national identificational decision to be part of the West, and Russian presence in SCO, in BRICS, practically prohibits Georgian participation. So for Georgia, bilateral multivectoralism is the path forward, or what do you see? Which are the most influential and most important bilateral partnerships for Georgia, and how could they be developed? Mr. Sharashenidze.
First of all, I think regional bilateral partnerships with our neighbors, we assume we don't have any territorial dispute, thanks God, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey. Russia remains an important trade partner, but of course, well, there's the territorial disputes and issues. And now, as well, like relations with the United States, they have paramount importance for Georgia. The United States is the only power that can deter the possible Russian threat, of course. European Union, it matters, but it turned out recently that European Union hardly has any leverages on Georgia. Hardly any economic leverages, even in political leverages. All the European Union can do now is to threaten and to cancel visa-free regime with Georgia, and that's it. You know, only that weapon is on the table. China, well, China matters for Georgia. China matters because China is another great power that somehow can neutralize and deter, once again, possible Russian threat. Possible, once again, because I believe that Russians are not going to invade Georgia in any foreseeable future, because simply, at least, we are not giving them any pretext for doing that. But once again, the memories of 2008 are still fresh, and Georgian people and government as well, I guess, very wary of such developments. But you cannot cheat geography. Georgians learned this bitter lesson. We cannot cheat geography. Russia is going to remain our neighbor, and sooner or later, maybe, let's say, hopefully sooner or later, we find some kind of a compromise.
What about the relationship between Georgia and Turkey? How does it shape the future of Georgia's economic and geopolitical space or place in Eurasia?
Georgia has, independent Georgia, which came into existence after the collapse of the Soviet Union, has no grievances with Turkey, obviously. There's, of course, thinking that, of course, some countries like Georgia, especially Armenia, have some bitter memory, historical memories when it comes to Turkey. But Turkey has been keeping very, very low profile, especially in Georgia, not to arouse unpleasant memories. And so far, so very good, let's say. We understand very well that every single country, especially regional powers, they pursue always their own interests in our region. But so far, let's say, Turkish interest has not gone against our national interests.
You mentioned that Georgia doesn't have a territorial dispute with its southern regional neighborhood, but I had the privilege, and now I will turn to Mr. Husseinov. I had the privilege of taking part in one of your trips to Yerevan. It was 2 weeks ago. We both attended the Orbeli Forum, organized by the Orbeli Center in Yerevan, and there it has been kind of established between experts that there is not a region in South Caucasus. It's not a region. There are closed borders, practically no economic cooperation, and even the Georgian-Azerbaijani border is not accessible through cars and trains for passengers, private passengers. So it's not a region, but it could be a region. And in this forum in Yerevan, Rusiv, you have outlined and proposed some regional cooperation mechanisms. What is your perspective and Azerbaijan's perspective for the peace, if it will be achieved in the future? How could the South Caucasus become a region?
Thank you, Peter, for this question. Yes, indeed. During my visit to Armenia, I had a chance to speak at an international conference, and I remember our panel was designed in a 3+3 setting, which means we had representatives from 3 South Caucasus countries plus neighboring powers, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. But as it always happens, these proposed setting could not match the reality because the Turkish panelist was absent. So politically, we never also had a real 3+3 meeting ever because Georgia rejects to participate in these summits. Back in Yerevan, and here I would like to share my own vision how I see South Caucasus, which, yes, you have stated, and some of other experts from our region do also claim that we don't have South Caucasus as a unified region or as a regional unit, whatever term you would like. We don't know how 3+3 would work in the future. It may be successful, it may fail. However, in the past couple of months, I have been lobbying actually for the South Caucasus trio. So in my understanding, we have to have a core formula here, which is 3 countries, and then we may actually bring several variations. It can be 3+3 again. It can be 3+1 vis-a-vis the United States, 3+1 vis-a-vis the EU, 3+2 the EU and US. Even if you like 3+5, South Caucasus and Central Asia, because of these connectivity projects such as the Middle Corridor, these two regions, they are getting closer, and at some point, the connection between them, like physical connection, is inevitable. I was attracted, while working on this concept, I was attracted by several regional integrationist projects here in Europe. It's a Baltic trio, it's Visegrad 4, and as a fellow at this very institution, I'm now studying, well, actually, I haven't studied, but don't tell it to Agnes Vash. I'm trying to study how the Visegrad 4 model can actually bring some interesting elements for our region. I want to understand its evolution, its current state, successes and mistakes, in order to be able to extract key takeaways for our region. And if you think maybe the European models cannot work for South Caucasus, then we can simply turn our head eastward and just check what is happening across the Caspian Sea. It's Central Asia, where 5 stans, they have actually built some sort of regional affiliation, regional identity. And in certain geopolitical occasions, they can actually can come up as a united front, despite all their internal differences, despite the border clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, for instance. And most recently, they had this 5+1 summit in the United States. And this is how they treat, and they are treated by different external powers. Therefore, I think for us, for the next several years, one of the priorities, I mean, the experts from 3 countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, should be working in this direction, to establish this core regional formula. Maybe if we think starting with very difficult projects, which would definitely need political will from either capital, is difficult or impossible to conduct, we can start baby steps and actually work on with non-political issues. For instance, regional disaster response mechanisms, because all 3 countries, they are prone to different natural disasters, floods, earthquake, and they usually have trans-border nature. And in those cases, the coordination of efforts among these 3 countries can be very critical. But my personal hope or dream is to have, and this will probably be the climax of this concept, have a regional summit. Again, you have this in Central Asia, where 5 leaders, they meet for annual summits to discuss regional issues. We can still have arguments, we can still have certain feuds and internal differences, but having some sort of summits at the level of leaders, at the level of foreign ministers, or at the level of other governmental agencies, that would definitely help us finally create South Caucasus as a unified region. They can be inter pares. They can be among equal partners, together with other external powers.
Mr. Melikian, how do you see the realities of such a 3+, the continuation or even revitalization or the actual putting into action the 3+3 format, or the proposal of Mr. Husainov on a South Caucasus 3 format?
Well, the 3+3 is what is also called the regionalization approach, when you want to see all your problems discussed inside of the region, plus 3 big or regional powers who have their play in the region and to have some influence, and they project their influence over those 3 South Caucasian countries. It's an important observation to say that, yeah, we can have a region if we overcome all these difficulties. It's a great example, Central Asia. I am working closely with especially Kazakhstan, and I visit very often Astana, and I see how they really move forward with this integration, and it's really an example besides European Union, because sometimes European colleagues always bring the EU example, which is a great example, but besides that, in a different context, Central Asia is a great example. Although the contexts are different, of course, but well, we can hope, and we are still hoping since 90s that we, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that we can have a region, a prosperous, stable region where everyone can travel to, to 3 capitals. But unfortunately, we are not still there. So I see probably three scenarios to overcome those difficulties. The first would be, probably one of the most difficult, is to see the democratization in all 3 countries, because democracies don't fight with each other. And 3 democracies would be, but we are still very, very far from being a democracy, to be honest. The second would be the closing the page entirely, the history, which also has some risks, because when you don't solve problems, you have many latent, let's say, problems inside of society, which on this or that occasion will erupt somehow. And third is to solve gradually problems and to move forward gradually by like the demining process, to demine all mines and slowly going forward, which is also somehow very there is a lot of risks for that as well, because there can be the change of the power of the government, of the regimes, and then everything can collapse. So, but the 3+3 is basically Turkish, Iranian, Russian initiative that Georgia is not joining, but Armenia and Azerbaijan are. Although it's not, I wouldn't say that it's a viable, platform or format. There are many other formats that, and the idea of the summit is a good idea, I think, to have 3, maybe to meet in Tbilisi or somewhere else, and to discuss. It doesn't mean that things will be solved like in the Israel and Gaza case and Palestine case. It's not, you can have 70 years of discussions and negotiations. It doesn't mean that it brings to something when you have a real problem and you have completely different interests and they are colliding. They are not aligning with each other. So, but we have this hope, let's say. I don't like that, to be honest, because in analysis, the hope is not a category. So, but let's have that hope that we can overcome somehow those things, and we will have a better future.
Thank you so much. On that note, I would like to open the most exciting part of our discussion, the Q&A. We only have so much time for maybe 2 questions, and I would like to collect them all together. And please, if you do, yes, Mr. Rapkus, please state your name and affiliation. Thank you.
Hello. I wanted to ask the Belarusian analyst. At some point, Ukraine-Russia war will end, and there will be a peace agreement, one or another. What interest Belarus has in this agreement? Security interest, other interest that Belarus will try to perceive if it will be part of this process. We know that President Lukashenko has signaled to Americans that he wants to help with the peace process and the settlement. What are your security interests or other interests in this deal that is going to be important not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for Europe, for NATO, for US and other players?
Let's collect one more if there is any. Yes, Sultan.
I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Melikian with respect to a couple of points. And first of all, he mentioned that Azerbaijan put forward a number of preconditions. And as far as I know, Azerbaijan only had one condition to sign a peace, and that one was, let's say, connected to the amendment to the constitution of Armenia. And then you mentioned about the opening of Zengezur corridor and stated that it would be beneficial for just Azerbaijan and Turkey and that's it. And how about Armenia? Don't you think that unblocking of communication ties, the opening of borders between Azerbaijan and Armenia and Turkey won't be beneficial for Armenia as well? And lastly, about the security guarantees, I wonder in what format you see the security guarantees for Armenia. Is it something related to the signing of separate treaty between Armenia and other parties, or how do you see it? Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we will start with Mr. Prayarman.
Thank you very much for that question. Well, first of all, I think Minsk indicated and clearly stated that it was interested in joining any negotiations about ending the war pretty early, I think, a few weeks into the fighting. Official Minsk already made that statement. At the time, you know, a lot of people, especially in the EU, were looking at those statements with a smile, but then 2 years later, High Representative Borrell, and I guess now everyone else, are also running around with this idea that the EU should be at the table. So obviously we all want to be at the table because we don't want our interests to be decided by others. So that's pretty clear. So in terms of what we might be looking for in the agreement, I think there are 3 layers of interest we might have in a potential future agreement. The first one is very simple. We are primarily interested in having the fighting end. So everything which will not only lead to a ceasefire, but make that ceasefire sustainable will be a fundamental Belarusian interest, just because of geography. Sometimes I think people don't really understand how close the war is to Belarus and what it really means, because I often hear discussions in the expert community about how Belarus benefits from the war, you know, economic contracts and so on and so forth. Of course, Belarus does have to diversify its economic activity given the Western sanctions, and that's why it has to do more on other markets, including in cooperation with Russia. And when you do more there, you earn more. So that's true. But to say that we're so happy about the war just because we managed to get additional contracts, it's just insanity again. So number one, we need a stable ceasefire. Number two, we will be interested in having such an agreement between Russia and Ukraine, which will quickly facilitate possibilities of economic cooperation between Belarus and Ukraine. Ukraine used to be our number 2 trading partner, and of course, logistically it was a key partner, because once the war started, our Lithuanian friends also closed the possibilities to transport our goods using the ports of Klaipėda, for example, and using the Baltic Sea. So in order to counterbalance the influence by the Lithuanians, we need to restore some cooperation with the Ukrainians, which is pretty natural. And the final bit, the final layer, has to do with more general aspects of European security. Belarus is a country which is not just neighboring on Ukraine, and that is why it's so close to that fighting, but also in this most dangerous area in Eastern Europe today. Whatever happens in the future, God forbid, but if there is a horizontal escalation of the fighting, we will be the first ones to feel that and to suffer it. That's why we are among those who are vehemently interested in having a sustainable security arrangement in Europe. I think no one is naive to expect a quick return to some kind of fully fledged European security architecture. That is why, under these realities, we just need a stable situation in terms of reducing military risk. So I don't think this will be a big part of any future agreement between Russia and Ukraine, but perhaps it could be included somehow in that agreement. All sorts of confidence and security building measures where, you know, Belarus could ensure that we just, you know, reduce risks, even though there will be growing militarization on both sides.
Thank you, Mr. Melikian.
Sultan, thank you very much for very interesting questions. I will be very quick because we are running out of time. Azerbaijan, one of the main preconditions is the change of constitutional reforms. But before that was, for example, to recognize Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. Before that was another precondition. Before that was another precondition. So all the time we have new preconditions. So I listed the preconditions which are somehow official, somehow non-official, but they are on the list. So we you know, you also know that they are on the list. Zangezur corridor. This is exactly what I was saying. If we unblock all communications, west, east, north, south, and Armenia can make trade through Azerbaijan, for example, through Turkey, through Iran, it would be great. But the Trip corridor and Zangezur corridor, at least for now, is only for about passing through Armenia, which is a part of middle corridor, which is for Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Armenia can just maybe have some royalties from that, transition, but no more than that. This is the problem, that Armenia, and also many officials from Azerbaijan declared that Armenia cannot use that, at least for now, to transit its goods, from that part to the other part, including to Turkey. This is all about the Crossroads of Peace initiative that Armenia's leadership is trying to push, rather than just one communication to be open for Azerbaijan and Turkey. And when it comes to security guarantees, when before signing or initialing this document for about 3 years, Armenian and Azerbaijani sides have been discussing and negotiating also the part of security guarantors. First it was about France, then they switched to the United States, and some others, Germany for example. But all of them basically, and it was, I think, natural to say, no, I mean, guys, you have to, sort out yourself, your problems. We can just give other stuff, for example, investments and other things. So it's why when we see the Trump initiative, the first question was, is the United States becoming the security guarantor of that, at least, project? They say yes, probably, because they will invest. We are not sure. We don't have the action plan. We don't know who will finance, what kind of organization will basically monitor and operate that part. Just one thing to mention, we have a railway or railroad thing, 42 kilometers. According to the agreements that Armenia has with Russia, all railroads belong to Russia. Armenia basically gave up all the railroads about 15 years ago. Although there is a discussion if it will belong to Russia if there is a new railroad. Recently I met with Azerbaijani colleagues and they were saying that even Azerbaijan has some rights on that road coming from the Soviet Union. So there are so many complicated technical stuff just before talking about what is the profit of Armenia. But of course, the idea of opening of borders, of course, it's what we are looking for. And but again, on what terms? I mean, what is Armenia gaining from all that stuff? Is it another way of making pressure on Armenia to make concessions and not anything from Azerbaijan? So just because Azerbaijan consider Armenia as a losing part, so there has nothing to concede to Armenia, because we are, as you say many times, that Armenia humiliated Azerbaijan for 30 years, now time for Azerbaijan to humiliate Armenia. So just be thankful, is what we heard from different Azerbaijani sources. Be thankful that we are even not splitting Armenia into two parts, like in the case of Germany. Yeah, but I hope that these are just rumors, these are just discussions that we can overcome altogether. Thank you.
Maybe we can overextend our time if maybe Rusif would also like to share his views on this.
Well, I like to be more optimistic in these discussions. But overall, I'm very much acquainted with the Armenian narratives and also skepticism, because I regularly speak with Armenian counterparts on different venues. I totally understand their concerns. At the same time, as I have already tried to explain, we have our own experience and traumas and concerns which we feel they should be taken into consideration. Regarding just one anecdote, if we have time. I was on the Armenian TV several months ago, and we were discussing potential Russian comeback to the region after the war in Ukraine comes to an end. And I said, guys, we are in a slightly more advantageous position than Armenia and Georgia, because we have a security umbrella called Turkey. And neither Armenia nor Georgia have their Turkeys. And then the Armenian counterpart, he also he agreed and then added that Armenia may also have an advantage. It doesn't border with Armenia, although it has a Russian military base on the Armenian soil. And we came to a conclusion that the most vulnerable element in this setting was Georgia, both direct borders with Russia and Russian army on the Georgian. So overall, having security guarantees, it's a very difficult topic, I understand, but I remember that starting from last year, there have been some talks and some ideas about bringing Turkey as a security guarantee for Turkey at some point in the future.
Thank you all so much for this really very insightful conversation. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I would also like to extend our gratitude to the audience, all those who follow us, maybe, I don't know if it's streamed online. And please follow our social media accounts on Facebook and Instagram and join our upcoming events. And well, thank you all.
So with that, we wrap up our second panel of the day. As we near the end of our event, we'll hear some closing remarks from Ruslan Bortnik, Senior Research Fellow at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, who'll reflect on some of the discussions we've had today.
Thank you, Lilian. Thank you, colleagues, dear guests, distinguished colleagues, and just friends. I have a honor but sad role to make some closing remarks for the EastSec Forum. And at the beginning, I want to thank you, all the participants, for the substantive discussions, the honest positions, and the refusal to pretend that complex problems can be solved with a simple recipes. Over these 2 days, we have not created a new security architecture, of course, but we have outlined the contours of what it could become if Europe continues to think strategically and if partners to the East and the West maintain the courage to act. A shared understanding of risks is already half of the path towards solutions. The other half, as always, will require political will. Sober assessment of reality and the ability to listen to one another even when geography and history pull us in different directions. Budapest has once again demonstrated that it is a good place for open, candid dialogue where difficult conversations can be held honestly, respectfully, and without illusions. It is an important and very rare thing today. I have a significant hope that our forum will become annual and we will meet at the same time at the same place next year. And let a simple yet enduring idea close our discussion, one that somehow survives every era of turbulence. Peace is not the absence of the conflict, but the ability to cope with it. Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you once again, friends, and Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, looking for you to see you again in our next events. Thank you and see you again.
Thank you, Ruslan. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we conclude our program today. On behalf of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, I want to extend our sincere gratitude to our moderators and our speakers for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. And of course, thank you to all of you for coming and engaging and for all the thoughtful questions. We invite everyone to now join us for lunch, which will be served right outside the conference room. Enjoy your lunch and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.